Okay, so in answering and offering a counter-narrative approach to Area 3 of review of content and studying, I've been asked how I will ask my students to interact with content information. And I've already described in previous post ways in which I've been asked to interact with content and information. And seeing that that is and has been very problematic, I plan as a teacher and promise as a future educator to take almost a completely separate and unique approach than to one that I was modeled for, one was modeled for me. And, in doing so, we have to, and I have to, really not try to reinvent the wheel. And so using books like Joyful Learning by Paula Kluth and Alice Udvari-Solner is something that would be preferable. They work on active and collaborative learning in inclusive classrooms, and in discussing this, I think it is most important to discuss the idea of collaboration. And Celia Euler, is very interested with that type of collaborative learning and collaborative approaches to learning as well in her democratic classroom models. And so in doing so, Kluth and Udvari-Solner say that one reason we promote this type of instruction is related to student response. And so again, that responsiveness comes in. We find that students, including those in our own university classrooms, react very positively to active and collaborative learning techniques, and that this type of teaching lends itself well to differentiation and individualization of instruction. Furthermore, in our observation, students are more engaged and seemingly comprehend more when they have agency in the learning process, and that they wrote on their preface, in their preface pages, to their list of instructive activities. And I think it's so important that they preface it as such, and so I'm going to preface my own ideas as such, that I want to be a type of educator that allows agency in learning and empowers agency and empowers, alternative forms of agency and an interaction that is, in this area especially, that is of the utmost importance to not only empower collaboration, but to allow opportunities for students to see different ways of collaboration and different ways of having roles and responsibilities. And in doing so, I think that as an educator, I'm going to be relying really heavily on groupings, especially, flexible types of groupings, heterogeneous, homogeneous, small, whole group, large, pairs. I think in groupings is where obviously collaboration happens, where we are exposed to multiple perspectives, and where in a lower stakes environment, students will be given the opportunity to try on different roles and try on different hats, if you will, and be different people and do things in different ways. And I think in those groupings you can assign roles, and a lot of this is discussed by the scholars we have read in class about the importance in collaborative learning and collaborative learning activities to assign roles and responsibilities to students. And I think going back to Area 1 in terms of directing, but more so facilitating, I think that's where I'm going to ask my students to really step up to the plate and really ask my students to interact. I think that's really the space in which it's safe to ask something of my students, to ask them to be the captain this time, to be the recorder, to be the representer, to be the drawer, to be the typer, to be the anything, to be the something of the group, and to take on those roles and responsibilities. And I think on top of that, something that's most important in groupings is reflection. And so we did some type of reflection even in this course on our experience in the curriculum unit planning. And although, at first students are hesitant and it feels, as if moaning and groaning through the activity, it is a great practice to start, and to become familiar with. And I want my students to be familiar with that metacognition, those metacognitive activities, that reflection on experience, reflection of self, reflection on biases, assumptions, and our, experiences with things. I want them to get ready to do that from day one. So as an educator, I promise to force my students to think about their thinking, force my students to do what the dominant approach to education usually doesn't, which is interrogate everything they're doing, saying, and hearing, and everything that they're being exposed to, and to not take things for face value, but to interrogate content. And I think as an educator, that is my number one promise to myself and to my students, is to have them interact with the content almost a little hesitantly, in a way where they don't just accept things for what they are, but they digest them and interrogate and explore what those things mean in their lives and the way in which that content manifests itself in their own experience. And so it could be different for everyone. And so I'm really excited, actually, about those types of interactions and engagements with my students, because I can't even foresee the type of things that are going to happen. More specifically, in terms of interaction, I think it's important also to talk about the physical environment in which you are asking your students to interact with content. And a lot of this was touched upon in our readings about the importance of environment, specifically from a disability studies approach, and the importance of creating an environment that's accommodating and making modifications accordingly. And so I promise and pledge to my future students that I will do the best of my ability in accommodating them in that way. And so I think even just doing that, turning the lights off when they need it, fixing the temperature, fixing sound, and I talked about this in Area 2 and Area 1, but putting large print, fixing captions, creating multiple modalities. In that way, I can ask them to interact in a more fair, with a more fair approach. And I'm not setting them up to fail. And so, again, in my interaction, as I've talked about in the last two areas, co-construction and co-creation, and of course, again, collaboration are of the utmost importance. My students are going to be a part of the process 100%. And in doing so, they're not going to only be asked to interact with content, but to interact with their interaction with content, to interact and think and plot and ponder the ways in which that content is affecting them, and the ways in which how they approach the content changes it, or if it doesn't. And if if our assumptions about the use of multiple modalities and different types of modifications really does compromise education. And I want my students to ask those questions. I don't want to make those decisions behind closed doors. And so in this area, I think the key word would be collaboration, to be honest. As a quick response, if I had to say one word about Area 3, it'd be collaborative learning, which I guess is two words, but collaboration then, to cut it short. And in those interactions, asking the complex thinking questions and presuming that my students are capable of giving complex answers and critiquing is also important. So collaboration and complexity, I think, here is the interaction response that I want to get. And I don't know, I think also something that's really important in this light is interacting with a live content, and bringing content to life, and taking it off the page, I think is really important. Also, I think that asking my students to interact with content in such a complex and critical way that is just, on a page or on a website is really shallow. And so as an educator, I make the commitment to bring in, live, realistic, authentic, genuine examples and authentic activities. And so a lot of these activities that Kluth and Udvari Solner talk about are bringing the content to life. And a lot of the things that Euler talks about and that Cochran Smith and Ernest Morrell that I mentioned in earlier posts talk about is students succeeding and having greater academic success in a live content, in content that comes alive in their community, that comes alive in their own lives, and that is manifested in an authentic way. And so bringing in food, if we're talking about it, bringing in live speakers and community heroes and students' parents, and bringing in newspapers and bringing in videos and media and creating context for the content so that students can have a greater engagement and interactive relationship with it. And so kind of doing my side of holding my side of the bargain for my students, again, so that not setting them up to fail, not asking them to ask critical questions without offering them all of the tools that it would take to answer those critical questions. And so asking them why, but also giving them adequate evidence, or at least adequate opportunities to find evidence in order to answer that why, or why not, and how, and what do you think, and what would be if, and just asking questions, but giving adequate opportunity for answering. And I think a lot of teachers forget that step, that, being a more inclusive teacher and being a more democratic teacher and allowing for collaboration means that your role is then diminished. And I think in this area, it's specifically important to say that studying and review of content is not on the onus of the student, always. There is a lot that falls on the shoulders of a teacher, and to disregard that role is really really disabling, to use the term, disabling your students in that effort. And so in this light, I'd like to disrupt the narrative as an educator by taking on and empowering myself and embodying and being proud and taking ownership over the responsibility I have also in this area. The responsibility I have of reviewing content, of being familiar with content, of studying the content, of being familiar with all of the resources, with all of the areas, with all of the assessments, and knowing a step ahead and 2 steps ahead of what my students are doing and what they're going to do. So really just being a planner. It sounds kind of cliche, but I promise to be a planner. I promise to review the content that I want my students to review and to interact with the content that I want my students to interact with. And in doing so, I think I'd be a better role model, a better, physically a better modeler if I've already done all of the activities. And I'll just be a better teacher. I think it makes for really powerful teaching if you do the things that you ask your students to do. And so bringing to life content in my own life as well, and truly selling it to myself so that my students can buy it, I guess, and then sell it to others. I know it's a constant growth process, but I think it's a good start.